Mona Yvette Nelson. On Christmas Eve 2010, in Houston, Texas, a scene unfolded that would horrify a community and leave a family forever changed. Mona Yvette Nelson, who was 44 years old at the time, worked as a welder and had been a former professional boxer. She was also a mother to twins and claimed to be a grandmother who loved children. Nelson knew the Foster family casually, having some level of familiarity with them through their neighborhood connections. On that Christmas Eve, while Angela Davis was at work, her son Jonathan was at home. What happened next would become one of Houston's most disturbing cases. What happened to Jonathan Foster? Jonathan, who was 12 years old, vanished from his home while his mother was away. Nelson kidnapped the boy, taking him from the safety of his residence. She then strangled him, ending his young life through this fatal act. However, Nelson's actions didn't stop there. In what investigators would describe as particularly disturbing behavior, she burned Jonathan's body using a blowtorch, then wrapped the remains in carpet. She transported the body and dumped it in a ditch, attempting to conceal what she had done. 4 days later, on December 28th, Jonathan's body was discovered. The burns were so severe that dental records were required for identification. The forensic examination revealed the extent of what Jonathan had endured before being found. How was Nelson caught? Multiple pieces of evidence led investigators to Nelson. Cell phone records placed her in the vicinity of where Jonathan's body was found. Surveillance video captured her truck at the dump site, providing visual confirmation of her presence. Most damning, Nelson's DNA was found on Jonathan's sweatshirt, directly linking her to the victim. When police interviewed Nelson, her stories changed multiple times. She eventually admitted to dumping a container, but claimed she didn't know what was inside it. She stated she had been paid $20 by an acquaintance and was intoxicated on vodka at the time. These explanations did little to counter the physical evidence against her. Nelson was arrested on December 30th, 2010, just days after Jonathan's body was discovered. During her time in custody and interviews, she made statements defending herself, saying, "I'm not a monster. I have 5 grandkids and I love kids." However, investigators noted she showed no genuine remorse during questioning. Detectives working the case described Nelson in chilling terms. They called her a cold, soulless murderer with pretty cold eyes. Some investigators suspected there might have been prior victims, though this was never proven. What were the trial and sentencing outcomes? Nelson's case went to trial in 2013. She opted for a bench trial, meaning her fate would be decided by Judge Janine Barr rather than a jury. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with prosecutors Connie Spence and Suni Mitchell presenting the evidence against her. The evidence was substantial. Grainy surveillance video showing her truck, phone data placing her at key locations, DNA evidence, tools from her home that matched the crime, and her own changing statements. On August 27, 2013, Judge Barr found Nelson guilty of capital murder. Nelson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors did not seek the death penalty in her case. She attempted to appeal her conviction, but in 2015, the Texas First Court of Appeals denied her appeal, affirming that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient to support the guilty verdict. As of 2025, Mona Yvette Nelson remains incarcerated at the Murray Unit in Texas. Now 59 years old, she continues serving her life sentence without parole. There have been no recent appeals or changes to her status, and she will spend the remainder of her life in prison for taking Jonathan Foster's life on Christmas Eve 2010. The next case would involve a shocking act on Christmas Day itself. Alexis Valdez. On Christmas Day 2013, in Chicago's Northwest Side, what should have been a day of celebration became the scene of one of the city's most gruesome crimes. Alexis Valdez, who was 18 years old, lived with his aunt and her boyfriend in a basement apartment where tensions had been building. Valdez had been staying with his aunt rent-free on the condition that he would attend school or work. However, he had stopped contributing to household expenses and wasn't fulfilling his obligations. His aunt had been demanding that he leave, creating significant friction in the household. These disputes over his living situation would escalate to deadly consequences. Who was the victim? Silvestre Diaz Hernandez was 41 years old and was Valdez's aunt's boyfriend. He lived with them in the basement apartment and had been part of the discussions about Valdez needing to contribute or move out. What happened to him would shock even veteran Chicago police officers. What did Valdez do? On Christmas morning, Valdez attacked Diaz Hernandez with a hammer, striking him multiple times and creating a hole in his skull. After this initial attack, Valdez's actions became even more extreme. He severed Diaz Hernandez's head, ears, and nose, then cut off his left arm and gouged out his eyes. He also sliced the torso, creating extensive mutilation. In what would become one of the most disturbing details of the case, Valdez placed the severed head on his aunt's bed as a present. His intention, according to later statements, was to harm his aunt as well if she had returned early from a Christmas party she was attending. Valdez had played loud music to mask the sounds of what he was doing. He had also covered the windows to prevent anyone from seeing inside the apartment during the attack and dismemberment. How did authorities discover what happened? In a bizarre twist, Valdez himself called 911 to report what had occurred. During the call, when the operator asked about performing CPR, Valdez laughed, telling them the body had no head. This laughter during such a serious moment disturbed investigators and would later be cited by the victim's family as evidence of Valdez's callousness. When police arrived, they found Valdez covered in blood at the scene. He confessed immediately to what he had done, providing details about his actions and his motive. He told investigators that he had acted out of anger over the household tensions and the demands that he leave. The forensic evidence at the scene was extensive. Investigators found the butcher knife used for the dismemberment, blood throughout the apartment, and all the remains of Diaz Hernandez. The hammer used for the initial attack showed the force with which Valdez had struck his victim. What did the victim's family say? The impact on Diaz Hernandez's family was devastating. His stepdaughter, Angela Edwards, attended court proceedings and called Valdez a monster. She specifically referenced his laughter during the 911 call, noting how disturbing it was that he could find anything amusing about what he had done. Diaz Hernandez's daughter described her father as a good person who had provided for the family, especially after their mother's death. The family struggled to understand how a dispute over rent and household contributions could escalate to such extreme action. What was Valdez's sentence? Valdez was charged with first-degree murder and held without bail while awaiting trial. In 2017, when he was 21 years old, Valdez pleaded guilty before Judge Vincent Gowan. By pleading guilty, he accepted responsibility for his actions without going through a full trial. Judge Gowan sentenced Valdez to 33 years in prison. While this is a substantial sentence, it means Valdez will eventually be eligible for release, likely when he is in his 50s, assuming he serves the full term and receives no early release. Where is Valdez now? As of 2025, Alexis Valdez, now around 30 years old, continues serving his sentence in an Illinois correctional facility. There have been no reported appeals or updates to his case since his guilty plea and sentencing. The case remains closed. with Valdez having accepted the consequences of his Christmas Day actions. The following case would involve a family dispute turning deadly on Christmas Eve. Clifford Burns. On Christmas Eve 2013, in Lake Luzerne, New York, a domestic situation that had been escalating for months reached its deadly conclusion. Clifford Burns, who was 57 years old and worked as a tree climber, had been going through a contentious divorce with his estranged wife, Patricia. The Burns marriage had been troubled for years, marked by patterns that concerned family members and friends. Clifford had a history of treating Patricia poorly over minor issues, and there had been incidents that demonstrated concerning behavior. His family history also contained troubling elements that may have influenced his adult behavior. What was Clifford's background? Burns had experienced significant trauma in his youth. His father, James Burns, had a history of attacking his mother. In 1981, James shot Clifford's mother, Edith, though she survived. Then in 1984, when Clifford was 16, his father abducted his mother, shot a police officer, and then took his own life. Before this final act, James gave Clifford a power of attorney note, leaving the teenager with the burden of handling his parents' affairs. This traumatic history seemed to have affected Clifford's own behavior in relationships. He reportedly held a gun to Patricia's neck during one incident and engaged in verbal mistreatment of their 5 children. The patterns of interpersonal harm appeared to continue across generations. What happened on Christmas Eve? On that December evening, amid their ongoing divorce proceedings, Burns burst into Patricia's home in Lake Luzerne. He was dressed in camouflage, suggesting some level of planning for what he intended to do. He brought a knife that would become the weapon used in the attack. Burns stabbed his estranged wife, Patricia, who was 42 years old, inflicting fatal wounds. This occurred in front of their 14-year-old daughter, who witnessed her mother's final moments. The trauma of witnessing this would haunt the teenager forever. Patricia's daughter from another relationship, Megan, who was 22, attempted to intervene to protect Patricia. Burns stabbed Megan as well, causing serious injuries, though she survived the attack. The willingness to harm Megan demonstrated that Burns' rage extended beyond just Patricia to anyone who tried to stop him. What was Burns' motive? The motive centered on vengeance over the divorce and the associated issues like custody and financial support. Burns had left a bequest note before the attack, suggesting he had contemplated what would happen after his actions. He had also sent Patricia a cryptic text message stating, "I have a special gift coming soon," which in retrospect appeared to be a threat about the impending attack. The divorce had clearly consumed Burns, to the point where he decided that if he couldn't have Patricia, no one would. This possessive thinking, combined with his history of mistreating her and his own traumatic family background, created a deadly combination. How did the investigation proceed? The 14-year-old daughter called 911 during or immediately after the attack, bringing police rapidly to the scene. This quick response led to Burns' arrest shortly after the incident. The knife used was actually Patricia's own knife, which Burns had taken from the home to use as the weapon. The forensic evidence showed multiple stab wounds on Patricia, confirming the sustained nature of the attack. Megan's injuries were also documented, providing evidence of the attempt to stop Burns and his willingness to harm her as well. What was the legal outcome? In April 2014, Burns pleaded guilty to second-degree murder as part of a plea agreement. However, he later attempted to withdraw this plea, claiming he had been under emotional duress when he entered it. The court denied this motion to withdraw, finding that his guilty plea had been knowing and voluntary. On September 5, 2014, Judge John Hall Jr. sentenced Burns to 23 years to life in prison. This sentence meant Burns would serve at least 23 years before being eligible for parole consideration, though there was no guarantee he would ever be released. Burns attempted to appeal his conviction and sentence in 2015, but the appellate court denied his appeal, affirming both the conviction and the sentence. Where is Burns now? As of 2025, Clifford Burns, now around 58 years old, remains incarcerated in New York's prison system. There have been no recent updates about his case, no successful appeals, and no reports of parole hearings. He continues serving his sentence for taking Patricia's life on Christmas Eve 2013. The next case would become one of America's most famous and controversial. Scott Peterson. On Christmas Eve 2002, in Modesto, California, Laci Peterson vanished from the home she shared with her husband, Scott. At the time, Laci was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with their son, whom they had planned to name Connor. What appeared initially as a missing person case would become one of the most publicized criminal trials in American history. Who were Scott and Laci Peterson? Scott Peterson had cultivated an image as a successful fertilizer salesman living the American dream with his pregnant wife. However, beneath this surface, Scott was leading a double life. He was having an extramarital affair with a woman named Amber Frey, a relationship that prosecutors would later argue provided the motive for what happened to Laci. Laci was excited about becoming a mother and had been preparing for Connor's arrival. Friends and family described her as vibrant and loving, looking forward to the holidays and her baby's birth in the coming weeks. She had no reason to suspect that her life was in danger from the person closest to her. What did Scott claim happened? On Christmas Eve, Scott told investigators that Laci had vanished from their home while he was away. He claimed he had gone fishing in San Francisco Bay, providing this as his alibi for his whereabouts during the time Laci disappeared. He maintained this story throughout the initial investigation, appearing on television to appeal for his wife's safe return. However, as investigators dug deeper into Scott's life, they discovered the affair with Amber Frey. When confronted, Scott's explanations became increasingly suspicious. Amber cooperated with police, even allowing them to record phone conversations with Scott where he lied about his situation and whereabouts. When were the bodies discovered? In April 2003, 4 months after Laci's disappearance, bodies began washing ashore near where Scott claimed he had been fishing. First, the remains of a fetus were found. Then shortly after, the body of an adult woman. The remains were dismembered and had been weighted down, but the weights had apparently failed to keep them submerged permanently. DNA testing confirmed the worst fears. The bodies were Laci and Connor Peterson. The location where they washed ashore, near the area where Scott had claimed to be fishing, immediately raised investigative focus on him. The odds of this being coincidental seemed infinitesimally small. What evidence connected Scott to the crimes? While the case against Scott was largely circumstantial, multiple pieces of evidence pointed to his guilt. Investigators found Laci's hair on pliers in Scott's boat, suggesting she had been on or near the vessel. Cement anchors found in Scott's possession matched the type that would have been used to weight down a body. Scott's behavior after Laci's disappearance also raised suspicions. He was arrested while fleeing toward Mexico with dyed hair and a significant amount of cash, suggesting he was attempting to avoid prosecution. This flight behavior undermined his claims of innocence. What happened at trial? The trial, which began in 2004, was moved due to the massive publicity the case had received in Modesto. The prosecution presented their circumstantial case, arguing that Scott had wanted to escape his marriage and impending fatherhood to pursue his relationship with Amber Frey freely. On November 12, 2004, the jury found Scott guilty of first-degree murder for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for Connor's death. The different degrees reflected the jury's findings about premeditation regarding each victim. On December 13, 2004, he was sentenced to death. However, the death sentence was overturned in 2020 due to issues with juror bias during jury selection. Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2021, ensuring he would never be released regardless of the death penalty being removed. What about recent developments? The case took an unexpected turn in 2025 when the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a petition seeking to overturn Scott's conviction. The organization claims there is withheld evidence that was never presented at trial and has requested new DNA testing on duct tape found with one of the bodies. Scott has maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, consistently claiming he did not harm Lacey or Connor. The Innocence Project's involvement has given his supporters hope that new evidence might exonerate him, though prosecutors remain confident in the conviction. Scott is currently incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in California, serving his life sentence without parole. As the Innocence Project pursues their petition, he awaits potential developments that could lead to a new trial or exoneration. Until then, he remains imprisoned for the Christmas Eve 2002 deaths of Lacey and Connor Peterson. The next case would involve a tragedy in Boston. Aaron Pascal. On Christmas Day 2019, in Boston, Massachusetts, what should have been a joyous holiday ended in unimaginable tragedy. Aaron Pascal, a 40-year-old biotech executive, was found along with her 2 children at a parking garage near Northeastern University. Who was Aaron Pascal? Aaron was a professional woman working in Boston's biotechnology sector, an industry known for high pressure and demanding schedules. She had 2 young children, Allison, who was 4 years old, and Andrew, who was 15 months old. From the outside, she appeared to be managing both her career and motherhood, living in the Boston area with her family. However, beneath this exterior, Aaron was struggling. Her husband had reported that she was experiencing thoughts of self-harm, indicating that mental health challenges had been present. There had also been a domestic dispute that preceded the tragedy, suggesting relationship stress was contributing to her state of mind. What happened at the parking garage? On Christmas morning, Aaron brought her 2 children to the Renaissance parking garage near Northeastern University's Ruggles Station. The garage's height made it a location where falls would be fatal. Investigators believe that Aaron threw both children from the roof of the parking garage before jumping herself. All 3, Aaron, Allison, and Andrew, were found unresponsive at the scene. Despite emergency response efforts, all 3 died from injuries sustained in the falls. The location was not one the family frequented, and there was no apparent reason for them to be at that particular parking garage on Christmas morning. The choice of location and timing suggested planning rather than an impulsive act. How did authorities investigate? The investigation involved reviewing surveillance footage from the garage to understand the sequence of events. Investigators also examined family phone calls and communications leading up to the incident to piece together Aaron's state of mind and any precipitating factors. The forensic evidence confirmed that all 3 deaths resulted from fall trauma sustained from the height of the parking garage. The medical examiner's findings were consistent with investigators' theory about what had occurred. What did officials say? District Attorney Rachel Rollins spoke publicly about the case, calling it unspeakable. She used the tragedy as an opportunity to urge awareness about mental health resources, emphasizing that help is available for those experiencing crises. DA Rollins stressed the importance of reaching out when struggling and knowing that support systems exist. The case highlighted the intersection of mental health challenges, family stress, and the holiday season's particular pressures. For some individuals, the expectations and family dynamics around holidays can exacerbate existing mental health issues rather than providing the comfort and joy holidays are supposed to bring. Why was there no trial? Unlike the other cases discussed, there would be no trial for Erin Pascal because she died in the same incident that took her children's lives. The investigation concluded that this was a likely double homicide-suicide, meaning Erin was both perpetrator and victim. This outcome meant that while investigators could piece together what happened, there would be no courtroom proceedings, no testimony from Erin about her state of mind, and no legal accountability in the traditional sense. The case was closed investigatively, but left many unanswered questions about what could have been done to prevent such a tragedy. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would reveal how a trusted community figure concealed dark secrets. Bruce McArthur. In Toronto, Canada, Bruce McArthur presented himself as a respectable member of the community. He worked as a landscaper and even played the role of Santa Claus at a local mall, bringing holiday cheer to children and families. At 66 years old, McArthur seemed like a grandfatherly figure that people could trust. However, behind this facade lay a serial predator who would claim at least 8 lives. Who was Bruce McArthur? McArthur had been married and was a father of 4 before divorcing in 2013. He later remarried a man, seemingly settling into life in Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. His landscaping business gave him access to properties throughout the city, and his friendly demeanor made clients comfortable having him work on their grounds. However, McArthur had a history that should have raised red flags. In 2001, he had been convicted of an incident involving another man receiving probation. Despite this concerning background, he was later assessed as very low risk by probation officials, a determination that would prove tragically wrong. Who were McArthur's victims? Between 2010 and 2017, McArthur targeted and ended the lives of 8 men from Toronto's Gay Village neighborhood. His victims included Skandaraj Navaratnam and Andrew Kinsman, among others. Many of these men were immigrants who had come to Canada seeking better lives, making them particularly vulnerable targets. McArthur used his position and connections in the community to gain trust with these men. He met some through social circles and others through apps. His method was consistent. He would strangle his victims, ending their lives through this method. What he did with the bodies demonstrated chilling calculation. What did McArthur do with the remains? After taking their lives, McArthur dismembered the bodies, cutting them into pieces to facilitate disposal. He then used his landscaping work to his advantage, hiding the remains in planters at properties where he worked. These planters were filled with soil and plants, with human remains buried beneath, hidden in plain sight at homes throughout Toronto. The audacity of this disposal method was striking. McArthur maintained these planters as part of his landscaping duties, returning regularly to properties where his victims' remains were hidden. Property owners had no idea that the beautiful gardens McArthur tended contained such horror beneath the surface. Investigators also discovered that McArthur had taken photographs of his victims after death, keeping these images along with jewelry taken from them as trophies. These items provided crucial evidence of his crimes and helped identify some of his victims. Why did it take so long to catch him? The investigation into missing men from the Gay Village had been ongoing for years, but McArthur managed to avoid suspicion for a long time. Part of the problem was investigative failures that would later be acknowledged by Toronto police. There were concerns about whether bias affected the investigation, with some wondering if cases involving marginalized community members received less attention than they deserved. The breakthrough came through Project PRISM, a coordinated investigative effort, when Andrew Kinsman disappeared in 2017. Investigators discovered that Kinsman's blood was in MacArthur's van. This physical evidence provided the probable cause needed to arrest him. MacArthur was arrested in January 2018, caught before he could claim additional victims. The arrest led to searches of properties where he had worked, resulting in the grim discoveries in the planters. What was the motive? The exact motive for MacArthur's crimes remained unclear even after his conviction. Investigators suggested links to rough activities and control, but MacArthur never fully explained why he targeted these specific men or what drove him to take 8 lives over 7 years. The psychological factors that led a seemingly ordinary grandfather and mall Santa to become a serial killer remained largely unexplained. What was his sentence? Rather than face trial, MacArthur pleaded guilty in 2019 to all 8 murders. This plea spared victims' families from enduring a lengthy trial, but also meant many questions about his crimes would never be fully answered in court. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Given his age at sentencing, this effectively meant he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. At 66 when arrested, MacArthur would be over 90 before even being eligible for parole consideration. Bruce MacArthur is currently serving his life sentence in a Canadian federal institution. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until the 2040s, by which time he would be in his 90s if still alive. The case remains one of Toronto's most notorious serial offenses, and MacArthur's name is synonymous with the betrayal of community trust. The next case would involve a family massacre in a town with an ironic name. Jerry Scott Heidler. In Santa Claus, Georgia, a small town with a festive name, one of the state's most horrific family massacres occurred. On December 4, 1997, Jerry Scott Heidler, who was 20 years old at the time, committed acts that would earn him a place on death row and a reputation as what prosecutors called consummate evil. Who was Jerry Scott Heidler? Heidler had a deeply troubled background marked by early trauma. He had experienced mistreatment in foster care and reported hallucinations, suggesting serious mental health issues that went untreated. These factors would later be raised by his defense team, though ultimately they did not prevent his conviction and death sentence. Heidler had been living with the Daniels family, who had taken him in despite knowing about his troubled past. This act of kindness would have deadly consequences for the entire family. What happened to the Daniels family? On that December day, Heidler used a shotgun to end the lives of the entire Daniels family. His victims included Danny Daniels, his wife Kim, and their 2 children, Jessica, who was 16, and Bryant, who was 8. The systematic nature of the shootings demonstrated that this was not an impulsive act, but rather a planned massacre. He kidnapped and assaulted 3 foster girls who had been living with the Daniels family. These young girls, who had already witnessed the horror of the family's deaths, were subjected to additional trauma before Heidler was finally apprehended. What was Heidler's motive? The motive appeared to be rejection of his relationship with Jessica. Heidler had developed feelings for the teenage girl, but the family disapproved of any romantic connection between them. This rejection by the Daniels family, combined with whatever psychological issues Heidler was experiencing, appears to have triggered his violent response. The fact that he took the lives of the entire family, including young Bryant, who had nothing to do with the romantic situation, showed that Heidler's rage extended beyond just those who had rejected him. He wanted to destroy the entire family unit. How was Heidler caught? Heidler was arrested within hours of the crimes, apprehended before he could flee far from Santa Claus. The swift arrest meant he faced justice quickly. though there would be complications in his incarceration. In 1999, Heidler briefly escaped from jail while awaiting trial, creating additional alarm in the community. However, he was recaptured, and security measures were enhanced to prevent any further escape attempts. What happened at trial? Heidler's trial took place in 1999, just 2 years after the crimes. Despite his defense team raising his mental health issues, including his history of foster care trauma and hallucinations, the jury was not swayed to find him not guilty by reason of insanity. The evidence against Heidler was overwhelming, including forensic evidence from the crime scene, testimony about his relationship with the family, and his own statements. The jury found him guilty on all counts, convicting him of 4 murders, plus the additional charges related to the foster girls. He was sentenced to death for the murders, with additional consecutive sentences for the other crimes. The death sentence reflected the jury's finding of aggravating circumstances that made this case eligible for capital punishment under Georgia law. Heidler has pursued multiple appeals over the decades since his conviction. His legal team has challenged various aspects of the trial and sentencing, but appeals have been denied through 2024. Each appellate court that has reviewed his case has upheld the conviction and death sentence. The appeals process in capital cases typically takes many years or even decades, and Heidler's case has followed this pattern. However, as of the most recent information available, he remains on death row awaiting execution. Jerry Scott Heidler is currently on death row in Georgia, where he has been for over 25 years. He continues to await execution, though the timeline for when or if that will occur remains uncertain. Georgia, like many states, has experienced periods where executions are paused or delayed for various legal and procedural reasons. The following case would involve a grandmother and a deadly dispute over money. Adam David Wright. On December 23, 2023, just before Christmas, in the United Kingdom, Adam David Wright committed an act of extreme rage against his wife's grandmother. Wright, who was 39 years old, had been experiencing financial difficulties and saw June Henty as a potential source of money to solve his problems. Who was June Henty? June Henty was 77 years old and was the grandmother of Wright's wife. She was described by her family as a pillar of strength, someone who had been a source of support and stability for multiple generations. Despite her advanced age, she still maintained her independence and managed her own affairs. Henty had some level of relationship with Wright through his marriage to her granddaughter, likely seeing him at family gatherings and events. However, she apparently recognized warning signs about his character or financial desperation, which would lead to her fateful decision. What happened when Wright demanded money? Wright approached Henty with demands for money, expecting her to comply with his request. However, Henty refused to give him the funds he wanted. This refusal triggered a violent response from Wright that would prove fatal. In a sustained attack, Wright stabbed June Henty over 100 times. The sheer number of wounds indicated extreme rage and a complete loss of control. The attack was so severe and prolonged that it demonstrated Wright's determination to punish Henty for refusing his demands. Despite the brutal nature of the attack, Henty survived initially. She was able to provide crucial information to investigators before succumbing to her injuries. On June 14, 2024, nearly 6 months after the December attack, Henty died from complications related to the wounds Wright had inflicted. How did police catch Wright? Before she died, June Henty was able to identify Wright as her attacker. This eyewitness identification from the victim herself provided the foundation for the case against him. Wright was arrested on the same day as the attack, December 23rd, preventing him from fleeing or harming anyone else. The forensic evidence supported Henty's identification. The nature and number of stab wounds, along with any physical evidence left at the scene, corroborated that a sustained and vicious attack had occurred. Medical professionals who treated Henty documented her injuries extensively, creating a record that would be crucial in the prosecution. What was Wright's response? Rather than deny his actions or mount a defense claiming innocence, Wright pleaded guilty to murder. This guilty plea meant he accepted responsibility for ending Henty's life through the stabbing attack. It also spared Henty's family from having to endure a trial where graphic details of her suffering would be presented. The guilty plea came after prosecutors had built their case, making it clear that the evidence against Wright was overwhelming. With Henty's dying identification, the forensic evidence, and the circumstances of the attack all pointing to Wright's guilt, contesting the charges would have been futile. On November 27, 2025, nearly 2 years after the attack, Wright was sentenced for Henty's murder. The judge imposed a sentence of life in prison with a minimum term of 22 years before Wright would be eligible to apply for parole. This minimum term means Wright will be over 60 years old before he can even be considered for release, and there is no guarantee that parole will be granted at that time. The parole board would need to determine that he no longer poses a danger to society before allowing his release. Adam David Wright is currently serving his sentence in a UK prison facility. He will serve his minimum 22 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration in the mid-2040s. The case serves as a reminder of how financial desperation, combined with entitlement and lack of impulse control, can lead to tragic outcomes. The next case would involve a teenage perpetrator and a family tragedy. Jalen Holmes. On Christmas Eve 2024, in Beulah, Alabama, what should have been a time of family celebration turned into a scene of horror. Jalen Holmes, who was 18 years old, would be accused of ending the lives of his 2 stepsisters in an incident that shocked the Lee County community. Who were the victims? The victims were Madison Daly, who was 18, and Caden Lynch, who was 19. Both young women were Holmes' stepsisters, related to him through his parents' relationship or marriage. They were on the threshold of adulthood, with their lives ahead of them, when they became victims on Christmas Eve. The family dynamics that brought these young people together as step-siblings were part of a blended family situation. However, beneath whatever surface harmony existed, there were tensions that would prove fatal. What happened on Christmas Eve? According to reports, the incident began with Holmes assaulting his mother, indicating that family conflict was already occurring. During this confrontation, Holmes took a firearm that was in the home, arming himself with the weapon that would be used in the subsequent attacks. Holmes then shot both Madison Daly and Caden Lynch, using the stolen firearm to end their lives. The attacks occurred in the family home in Beulah, transforming what should have been a place of safety and holiday celebration into a crime scene. The motive for the shootings appeared to be connected to domestic incidents escalating. The assault on Holmes' mother suggested ongoing family conflict, and the stepsisters' deaths may have been part of this larger pattern of familial discord reaching a breaking point. How quickly was Holmes arrested? Law enforcement responded to the scene on Christmas Eve, and Holmes was arrested the same day. The rapid arrest meant he was taken into custody before he could flee the area or potentially harm anyone else. Holmes was charged with capital murder, Alabama's most serious homicide charge. Capital murder charges in Alabama can result in either life without parole or the death penalty, reflecting the severity of the alleged crimes. Holmes was held without bond, meaning he would remain in custody throughout the legal proceedings with no opportunity for release. What has been the community response? The Lee County community expressed devastation over the Christmas Eve tragedy. Beulah is a relatively small community where such violent incidents are rare, making the deaths of 2 young women particularly shocking. Family members of Madison and Caden described being devastated by the loss. They remembered the 2 young women and struggled to understand how a family gathering on Christmas Eve could end in such tragedy. The extended family had to cope not only with grief, but also with the fact that another family member was accused of being responsible. A fundraiser was organized to help the family with funeral expenses and other costs associated with the tragedy. Community members came together to support the grieving family, contributing what they could to ease the financial burden during an already difficult time. What is the current status of the case? As of the available information, Holmes' case is still pending trial. He remains in custody awaiting the legal proceedings that will determine his fate. The capital murder charges mean he faces the most serious possible penalties under Alabama law. The case is relatively recent, having occurred in late 2024, which means the legal process is still in its early stages. Prosecutors will need to present their evidence, and Holmes will have the opportunity to mount a defense or potentially negotiate a plea agreement. Given the severity of the charges and the fact that Holmes was 18 at the time, legally an adult, he will be tried as an adult and faces adult penalties. If convicted of capital murder, he could spend the rest of his life in prison or potentially face the death penalty, depending on prosecutorial decisions and jury findings. The final case would involve jealousy and a Christmas Day shooting. DeAndre Patrick Lawrence. In Warren, Michigan, DeAndre Patrick Lawrence, who was 23 years old, committed an act driven by jealousy that would result in serious charges and imprisonment. The incident occurred after what should have been a peaceful holiday exchange involving his children. What led to the shooting? Lawrence had delivered gifts to his 3 children on Christmas Day, visiting them at the home where they lived with his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. This type of arrangement, where separated parents coordinate gift exchanges during holidays, is common but can be emotionally charged. After the gift delivery, a fight or argument erupted. The specific details of what triggered the confrontation are not fully detailed in public reports, but it appears to have involved tensions between Lawrence and his ex-girlfriend's current boyfriend. The jealousy Lawrence felt about being replaced, combined with whatever was said during the argument, escalated the situation dramatically. What did Lawrence do? During or after this confrontation, Lawrence shot his ex-girlfriend's boyfriend twice in the back. The fact that the shots struck the victim in the back suggests the victim may have been turning away, fleeing, or otherwise not facing Lawrence when the trigger was pulled. The gunshot wounds caused critical injuries to the victim, requiring immediate emergency medical care. The severity of being shot twice, particularly in the back where vital organs are located, meant the victim faced a life-threatening situation and required extensive medical treatment. The shooting occurred on Christmas Day, in or near the home where Lawrence's children were present. This meant that not only was the holiday ruined, but Lawrence's children were potentially exposed to the traumatic scene of their mother's boyfriend being shot by their father. How did the legal case proceed? Lawrence was arrested soon after the shooting, taken into custody by Warren police. He was charged with serious felonies, including assault with intent to commit murder and firearm offenses. Rather than go to trial, Lawrence opted to plead no contest in December 2024 to the charges against him. A no contest plea is similar to a guilty plea in terms of accepting punishment, but it doesn't include an admission of guilt that could be used in civil proceedings. The plea was to assault with intent to commit murder and felony firearm charges, reflecting the seriousness of shooting someone twice in the back. These charges carry substantial prison time under Michigan law. What was Lawrence's sentence? In January 2025, Lawrence was sentenced for the Christmas Day shooting. The judge imposed a sentence of 12 to 22 years in prison, meaning he must serve at least 12 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. As of 2025, DeAndre Patrick Lawrence is serving his sentence in Michigan's prison system. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until has served at least 12 years of his sentence, which would be around 2035 at the earliest. Even then, parole is not guaranteed and will depend on his behavior in prison and the parole board's assessment of whether he poses a danger to society. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.